Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar. I'm delighted to see so many of you here today. Today's webinar is called Using Data Analytics to Understand Child Vulnerability, and it's great to see you. We have a packed agenda to get through today. But before we do that, I am just very quickly going to move on to some housekeeping, if I may. While we're getting ourselves straight and more people are going to join us, we're going to do a quick audio check. And if I could just point you to the panel on the right hand side where you should be able to see where you can raise your digital hand. And if you could do that, please, just so that I can know that you can hear us fine. While you're there, you'll also see the opportunity to ask questions in that panel, and there will be time throughout the webinar and at the end of the webinar to ask questions. So please do jot them in as and when they occur to you. Also there, you'll see there are 5 handouts for you to download at any time during the webinar, and we'll be referring to them at some point as well. With a couple of polls and a survey, so nice and interactive for you, and we will have you on your way by 11:30. Excellent, great. Thank you very much, everybody. Great to see all those hands going up. Thank you so much. Okay, so today's agenda, fantastic lineup for you today. Today's agenda, we're going to be looking at introductions to administrative data and child vulnerability. We are going to hand over to Haroon Chowdry from the Children's Commissioner's Office and look at their perspective. And we're also going to give our own perspective in terms of our research that we've been doing and the findings hot off the press for you. And as I say, Q&A and next steps as well. So lots of things to talk about. We've got some cracking speakers, and on the next slide you can see faces to voices. So Devon Galani is a director from Policy and Practice. Devon, do you want to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me.
Excellent, thank you. And Haroon Chowdry, Head of Analysis from the Children's Commissioner's Office. Haroon, do you want to say hello?
Hello, great to be here.
Thank you, Haroon. And also Dr. Ben Fell, Senior Analyst from Policy and Practice. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Looking forward to it.
Excellent, thank you. So those are the voices to the names. Webinars can be a bit odd sometimes, so we do like to let you know who's speaking and what they look like. So a little bit about Policy and Practice. For those of you who may not be aware of us, it's great to meet you. We are an organisation that believes the welfare system can work better. We kind of concentrate on 3 areas, if you like. The policy, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today. We're a team of professionals with extensive knowledge of the welfare system, and we're passionate about social policy and making it work. We do a lot of data analytics work, which we're going to be touching on today, as I say, helping people to explore data over time to identify those who need support, target, help and track interventions. And we also have our software as well. Now, our speakers are going to go into much more detail on all of these areas, so I don't need to say much more than that. But this is a little bit about us for those of you who who haven't met us before. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Devon to take it from here. Over to you, Devon.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks again very much for joining us. We thought we'd start this section off with a poll just to get you guys involved and ask you, how important is a preventative approach in your local authority? I think we can launch that poll
Excellent.
now. Fantastic.
Yeah, so the poll should be on screen. I'm not sure, Devon, if you can see the options. You can? Excellent, okay. Excellent, and I can see that everybody's voting.
Interesting watching them go up and down in real time.
Indeed, it is. Indeed.
But struggling to be funded as the leader.
Yeah. So we're all so this poll really is very much how important is the preventative approach in your local authority? Preventative meaning preventing vulnerability, and we can see all the different options there. So I think most people have voted. So thank you very much. I shall close the poll and then share the results so that you should be able to see them on screen. Over to the speakers.
Well, before moving on, I think it's, as Ben pointed out, 47%, so almost half of you said a preventative approach is very important, but we're struggling for it to be funded. We'll talk a little bit about that today, because I think some of the analytics work we're doing with the Children's Commissioner is about highlighting how important, how powerful and how practical it can be to both target and identify who you're going to target preventative support to, but also show the impact of those interventions over time. I'm struck by the don't knows. Perhaps we've got people here who aren't working within a local authority and don't quite know. Is there anything, Haroon, Ben, that you want to pull out of that?
Well, hopefully, if there are people within the don't know category who are working in local authorities by the end of this, they maybe will be able to give you a little bit more information about that and see the advantages.
Yeah.
I think it's good that, well, I think it's good that, the most common response is important, and nobody said it's not important. Those are definitely positives. But yeah, again, very interested by the 1 in 4 who don't know, and it may be because we all think that preventative approaches are important, but it's sometimes difficult to get the evidence to demonstrate that, and business cases are often very important here. But it certainly chimes. The rest of the findings certainly chime with what we know in terms of plurality of people, if not most people, thinking that prevention and intervention is important and people would do it if they had the resources to do so.
Great, and do ask in the Q&A about business cases and other things if we don't go into them in enough detail during the presentation, because that's certainly something that we want to be able to bring out. So I'm pleased we think prevention is important. That's really what the crux of today's webinar is. And the headline here, that we're trying to identify children who are at risk of being at risk. So what we found is that of children in local authorities, children's services departments track children who are in care, children who are at risk of being in care through a couple of their returns. They're not very good at identifying the children who are at risk of being at risk. And that's really where the conversation with the Children's Commissioner started. And Haroon's going to talk a little bit in a moment about their vulnerability index and the things that they were looking at. I think the conversation started because I think it is possible to identify children who are at risk of being at risk. And I was struck by, while children's services departments look at these two main data sets, children who are looked after and children in need, they don't actually have any data on the family context of those children unless it's in like an individual case record. They're not able to understand actually, in some cases, do these children who we're concerned about, do they have siblings? They don't know about the financial circumstances in which they come from. It's usually things like statutory contact with schools, with police, with other services, when actually, obviously, the family context plays a big role in determining who is at risk, certainly who is at risk of being at risk as well. The next couple of slides talk, we put these together for a presentation I gave on child vulnerability a little while ago, and this sort of really highlights that point. So we might know, local authorities might know the children who are in care. They might know, they also know the children who are at risk of falling into care, and they've got data on that. These are the children who are at risk of being at risk, and it's quite a large cohort, so around 1.2 million we estimated, kind of using the national figures, but actually within a local level, who are they? And that's really what we're going to try and show you today. It's possible to identify who is at risk of being at risk. And really what you want to do is, if you don't know this information, you're at risk of, when you sort of help a child, they sort of might circle back in once you've supported them. Actually, what you want is to create this journey in this direction, so children who are at risk of being at risk stop being there and hopefully move toward kind of a very stable situation. As certainly hope most people, yeah, that's what we all want. So before handing over to Haroon, I think another quick poll, if that's okay, to ask, what data does your authority use to identify people who are at risk? Because it's quite a data-oriented webinar, so it's helpful to know where we're at in terms of the audience. Janet, do you want to launch that poll?
Okay, so that poll should be launched and underway. Let me just double check.
There we go. Yeah, coming in.
Excellent, great. Okay, so Stephen said this poll is, what data does your authority use to identify people at risk? So please choose one of the following, and we appreciate that, you know, sometimes that there may be more than one option, but we're asking you to choose your most predominant option. So household data on children and families, household data only on children, household data on family circumstances only, or aggregate data on children and family, aggregate data on only one of those. Great, so I can see, as no doubt my colleagues can see some of the results coming in. Leave it a little bit while longer for a few more people to vote. So yeah, please do, and then we can have a conversation about the results. Great, okay, I think we'll leave it there, and I'll close the poll, and you can have a look at some of the results. Devon.
Well, fantastic. Well, Ben, Haroon, do you want to kick off, and I'll see if I've got anything to add.
So it's great to see that the number that the highest percentages in the household data on children and family, because I guess our point today is going to be that is the data that gives you both the most visibility and the most kind of operational, actionable insight. Haroon?
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely the most. We care about children. We care about which types of children are living with which types of adults. So it's really important to have data on both of those things at a household level. And that is certainly the most powerful data. And what strikes the positive, as you say, is that that's the most common response. I think the question that it sets off in my head is what would it take for the other 2/3 of respondents, if we're thinking about local authorities, to be able to do the same thing? How do we embed that practice more widely? Because I think that is what we should be aiming for universally across so that we can do really rich and sophisticated analysis everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I've just got two thoughts. I think one is just to be aware of the slightly biased sample. Because it's a policy and practice webinar, we do a lot of work with data, and we naturally attract people who are interested in data. So while I'm really encouraged by the 36%, it's probably worthwhile recognizing that at a national level, it's probably somewhat lower than that. And I think the other point, I'll save it as a question at the end, but I think for Haroon and Ben, but I'd like to ask them, just to preempt that, let them prepare for the question, is it's actually about linking these data sets together sometimes, and it would be really interesting to see what what the thoughts of the audience are on that too. So if we move on over to Haroon.
Thanks very much, Devon. So I'm going to talk about some more work that we've done with policy and practice. But before that, just a brief introduction to who we are. So I work for the Children's Commissioner's Office. Now that the Children's Commissioner herself is an independent role that is the country's voice of children, established by law to protect and promote the rights of children. The current commissioner is Anne Longfield, and she has a special responsibility for certain groups of children, particularly the most vulnerable children. So that is her remit as set out in legislation. In fact, the 2004 Children's Act. We have a special responsibility for particular groups of vulnerable children, those in care or receiving social care services, or living or accommodated by the state away from home. Interestingly, we have some particular statutory powers in order to help us promote those rights and views and speak up for children. That includes the right to visit an establishment where children are being accommodated away from home, and also to access data held by public organizations on children. That's a relatively new power that we've got, and is part of our kind of journey towards becoming a much more data-focused a data-focused organization, rather. We are, as I said, we're independent of government, but we always work with government, and our focus is always on children, and that's why I'm very glad to be participating in this webinar where it's about children, and our focus will always be on children. It will always be on England as well. There are commissioners for other regions of the UK, and perhaps with reference to our statutory powers, but also to our work on vulnerability, it's all part of our journey towards becoming a more data-focused organization. I think I like to think of us as perhaps one day being the IFS of vulnerable children. We're certainly on our way towards that. That's our aspiration. if anything. Now, we've done some very interesting work with policy and in practice, which I'll talk about in a second, but where that comes from is really our program of work over the last couple of years on measuring childhood vulnerability in England, and being able to quantify that. I think when our director of evidence joined the organisation, he was asked by the commissioner how many vulnerable children there are in England, and his response was, "I don't know," and frankly, nobody knows. It's too big a question. It's too complicated a question, and that effectively kicked off a program of work that we've been working for a few years now, to be able to define and classify and assess all the different types of childhood vulnerability, and gather together in one place all the data that we know of on how many children experience that type of vulnerability, and provide a common framework for others to use. We've now built that framework. I think it contains something like 71 different groups or types of vulnerability, which it shows just how broad the word vulnerability is. We all talk about it, but we may not always mean the same thing by it. It means very, very many different things, and each of those can be measured and counted in different ways. We've done the job of trying to bring that all into one place at a national level. It's also an important part of our role. You know, if our role is to speak up for vulnerable children, we can't really do that effectively without knowing how many such children there are and what vulnerabilities they have. Now, I said our framework has 71 different types of vulnerability in it. That's going into the detail. Is that they group into a number of themes, and this table shows just how broad it is. We've got everything. Our framework covers everything from the sort of the very hard end of children receiving statutory care or support, through to children who have perhaps health or developmental conditions, children living in households where there is a vulnerability at the household level, and I think that's where we'll, the rest of what I talk about will center is that vulnerable households. Our framework also covers children who are facing risks due to identity, nationality, or things that are going on outside the home as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to take over now and talk a little bit about how policy and practice and the Children's Commissioner kind of came to work together on a particular piece of research, looking at one specific source of vulnerability at the household level. So first of all, though, I just want to give a quick overview of kind of the approach that policy and practice takes to data and to identifying, engaging, supporting local authorities to engage at the household level. So the data that policy and practice uses to support councils in a variety of different sectors is based on household level administrative benefits data. And as we'll see on the next slide, this is how we're able to speak to some of the elements of vulnerability that the Children's Commissioner have identified in their framework. So we, in our kind of normal services for local authorities, we and advice organisations, we process this administrative data that's used for calculating benefit claims, housing benefit claims, and council tax support awards. We merge those data sets together alongside data on levels of household arrears, debt to local authorities, and also support payments, things like DHPs. We process those data, we standardize those data sets, we process them through our policy modeling engine. That's the same engine that sits behind our benefit and budgeting calculator, which some of you may have come across, which is a free online tool used by thousands of households every day to make financial decisions and make the benefit system work for them. Once we process by processing that administrative data through the engine, that allows us to combine the impact of all elements of the welfare system. We take in more than 4,000 individual parameters of the welfare system in order to determine each individual household's bottom line take-home income, their benefit eligibility, but also sort of derived information like their level of relative poverty or their income, the ratio of sort of income to costs. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on the analysis that we've done. We then pass this rich kind of array of household level information back to local authorities through our LIFT dashboard tool, which allows services within a local authority to see the sort of aggregate level, borough level statistics on sort of number of households in poverty, number of children in poverty, number of households who are going to be affected by welfare reform, but then also allows them to drill down to the individual household level and engage with individual families, individuals to support them. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through our approach. Where this merges with the Children's Commissioner's remit is in terms of the data that we have access to through these administrative extracts. This is a list of some of the fields that are identified in the Commissioner's vulnerability framework, which we can gain visibility over through this benefits data. So we have information on parental status, work status, tenure type, including temporary accommodation. As I said, we can calculate relative poverty, risk of food poverty, risk of future poverty, and we can look at, because the data is captured monthly and we are able to track households over time, we're able to look at more dynamic risk factors like relationship breakdown of parents.
And actually, this is also actually a great example of the benefit of administrative data here. So these are groups that are in our vulnerability framework and that you work on. And what we've learned from our work on measuring vulnerability is that there are things that we can measure, but there are so many gaps in what we're able to measure from publicly available data sources. Our estimates of these sorts of things, we have a national figure. We don't have that data by local authority. That's not reported, but admin data gives you the potential to do that, to build a local picture. We also, in publicly available data sources, there's no information on the outcomes of these groups. So how well do they do in school? Do they make successful transitions to adulthood? Being able to admin data that you could link together, if you could link with education data, for example, enables you to answer that question. And admin data is really the only way to do it properly. Also, the intersections of these groups. How many children are in 2 of those groups? How many children, what's the total number of children that are in at least 1 of those groups? Again, it's linking together different admin data sources that's going to answer that question. Really, with publicly available sources, which is all we've looked at, it's impossible to answer that question. And finally, you touched on it just there. The data that we've got, the data that we've been able to bring to the table it's really valuable, but it is generally snapshot data only. The great strength of admin data is that you can track these over time and then start asking, how many children are long-term, embedded persistently in these groups over 3 years, 5 years? How many children have ever been in one of these groups over that time period? And that allows you to identify, who are the children with persistent vulnerability, but also who are the children that at some point could go in and out of this group.
Fantastic, yeah. So that long-term vulnerability speaks to another piece of work that we've done with the Children's Commissioner, which we're not going to be covering today, as part of a broader project on child homelessness. But so as Haroon mentioned, we Policy and Practice have been working with the Children's Commissioner on a couple of sort of commissioned projects to sort of apply our repository of administrative data to answering a couple of these top level questions and kind of leveraging the unique value of administrative data to speak to some of these issues around child vulnerability. We did, so far, we've done sort of 2 pieces of ad hoc research. One, as I mentioned, around the long-term patterns of child homelessness. But the project that I'm going to talk about today, just to kind of give you an illustration of both the kind of big research questions you can answer with this data, but also how this data can be then applied to supporting individual households kind of instrumentally. This piece of research was on the impact of universal credit and associated welfare reforms. So there's a number of aspects of universal credit that are sort of cause for concern around households with children, particularly things such as the 5-week wait. There are also benefits that are not part of the universal credit per se, but kind of intersect with it, interact with it to increase levels of vulnerability, things like the benefit cap, lower benefit cap, and particularly the 2-child limit. Policy and Practice has given evidence to the Work and Pension Select Committee on the potentially very damaging impact that the 2-child limit can be having on households and as a driver of pushing children into poverty. So what we were tasked with by the Children's Commissioner was to quantify the impact of these welfare reforms on households with children. And what I'm going to do now is talk you very briefly through the methodology that we used, but quickly move on to the kind of top level results, some of the kind of key figures that we were able to pull out from our administrative data. And then we're going to move on to showing how you can apply that same sort of approach instrumentally in a local authority to identify and engage with these households who are at risk of being at risk. So the data that we used for this is going to get, sorry, this part of the presentation is getting me back to my academic roots. I will do my best to keep it quick. So the data that we were using for this project was benefits data, administrative benefits data from 19 UK local authorities. This comes to a total of around nearly 300,000 children. And the one I've included a lot of information on this slide, which you can see afterwards. The slides will all be made available, but maybe the key thing to take out here is that we do have quite a heavy London bias in the data that we have here. So just bear that in mind when reporting on, when interpreting some of the statistics I'm going to talk about moving on. As I mentioned before, the way that we handle this data is we standardize it and we pass it through our policy modeling engine, capturing all these elements of the benefit system. The unique value of this modeling approach, however, is that we can adjust those parameters of to essentially model scenarios in which elements of the current welfare system are not in place or where their parameters are changed. So for example, we can take households who are currently on the legacy benefit system and model their take-home income, their poverty status, their living standards, were they to migrate onto universal credit. We can also tweak how the welfare kind of instruments themselves work, for example, by removing the 2-child limit from the engine and showing how that changes households' level of financial vulnerability, similarly by removing elements like the benefit cap. And finally, we were able to do some stuff around different ways of migrating onto universal credit, whether people pass through the 5-week wait or whether they take the universal credit advance. I'll talk about that in a little while. And the final thing just to quickly cover on the methodology is our sort of key outcome measure that we were interested in for this piece of research. This is something that we use a lot with local authorities. It's our in-house measure of financial resilience. It represents a kind of ratio between households' total income from earnings and benefits versus their total household costs. Some of you may be familiar with the Social Metrics Commission work on poverty measurement, where they highlight the importance of unavoidable costs, particularly housing costs, so rent. We capture that in our measure, but we also include escapable costs, things like food costs, travel, energy costs, which we are able to estimate using ONS figures. And the key takeaway from this is we're able to classify households according to whether they have an income surplus or an income shortfall, if their income exceeds their costs or if their costs exceed their income. And I'm sure you can all see that households whose costs exceed their income are those particularly at risk of falling into debt or even in homelessness if their income is insufficient to meet their rent. So If you have further questions about the precise methodology that we use, then do feel free to reach out. My contact details will be at the end of the presentation, or ask questions during the Q&A. But let's get on to some results. So firstly, the 2-child limit. What we found was that of those households who are currently facing a cash shortfall, whose income is less than their costs, under the current system in which the 2-child limit is in place, 42% of those households would no longer be facing a cash shortfall if the 2-child limit was removed. So alleviating this pressure on households from the 2-child limit would place 42% of those 300,000 children in a better situation.
So another way of, if I just play that another way,
yeah.
I think what you're saying is because of the 2-child limits, 17,950 children are now at risk of being at risk, whereas they otherwise would not have been. Is that right, Ben?
That's exactly right, yeah.
I mean, how do you think the CCO, the Children's Commissioner, might be able to take this forward, or might be able to use this kind of information? Because that strikes me as quite powerful.
Yeah. So that's a very powerful finding, and there are other extremely powerful findings as well around things like the 5-week wait.
Which we'll come on to. So maybe we'll just ask you for a comment. What's your
but I think as with all of the findings, it's the numbers are shocking, but it's also for us the real takeaway is just that the actual feasibility of being able to do this, the fact that it can be done.
Yeah.
That's really our message, both to the sector, to local authorities, but also to national government. It can be done. We've shown it can be done in a few places with this data. But what can we do to make that kind of systematic and comprehensive?
Absolutely. So moving on to universal credit. This is more of a balanced picture. In fact, we find that 37% of households who are on the legacy benefit system and facing a cash shortfall would no longer be facing cash shortfall were they to move on to universal credit. This is quite consistent with other work we've done around the impacts of universal credit, that it does work well for some people, about 30% of households, and many households with children. The sort of inverse finding there is that 4% of households who have a cash surplus under the current system would face a cash shortfall if they moved on to universal credit. So for various reasons, it may not be such an optimal decision. And this again speaks to the idea of these top level statistics are important for organizations like the CCO to sort of hold DWP to account and say, is this system working as intended? But also, as we'll see later, being able to identify at a local authority level exactly who these households are can be very powerful for advice organizations in helping to make sure that families can make decisions that are right for them. Also worth keeping these statistics in mind, this 37% and 4%, when we get on to talking about some of the impacts that actually the process of migration can have on a household. And that's what we're going to come to now. So for the 5-week wait, the way that we modeled this was a little bit more complicated. We sort of took households' monthly income, and we assumed that through the process during the 5-week wait, households will lose all their tax credits, all of their DWP benefits, and they will use a sort of scaled equivalent of about 3 weeks worth of housing benefit, because they have a 2-week run-on of housing benefit, so that the impact there is not quite as severe. So during this modeling that we show here is the impact of on households' financial resilience during the 5-week period where they're having this major loss of benefit income. And as you might expect, the impacts are pretty severe. So of the households who had a cash surplus under the current benefit system, 70% of those households would find themselves facing a cash shortfall during the 5-week wait. 150,000 children placed into that at-risk of being at-risk group during that period. What we also were able to look at, because we have information on household savings, we sort of made the assumption that households facing this cash shortfall, they would likely dip into their savings to cover those costs. That just the process of dipping into those savings for households who had savings would see their savings reduced by an average of nearly £700. And about 50,000 households, were they to dip into their savings, would have their savings completely exhausted. So that would lead to a further sort of nearly 100,000 children in that very risky category of a household that has no savings, no buffer against potential financial shocks. Now, the assumption that people will dip into their savings is somewhat mitigated by the universal credit advance. This is something that DWP is increasingly recommending that households take. This allows households to take their first month's universal credit payment in advance to cover that period during the 5-week wait. It's not always 100% of the first payment, and there's more analysis that we could be doing to kind of make this a little bit more nuanced. But we basically took the assumption that if households take the advance, they will not have that income shortfall during their 5-week wait. But the problem with the advance is that advance is then recouped from universal credit awards during the following 12 months or 16 months from October 2019. What this means is, if we went back to these households who were better off under universal credit, actually, if they end up taking the advance during the 5-week wait, these benefits are going to be severely reduced. Of the house, I'll try and go through this one fairly slowly. So, of the households who would previously have moved from an income shortfall to an income surplus under universal credit, so those would have benefited, that number of households is reduced by 24%. So about a quarter of households who were benefiting from migration to universal credit, if they take the advance, they will no longer be benefiting. And 3,000 children who would have been sort of brought out of that vulnerability group are instead remaining in this vulnerability group. 3 times more households who, if they were to take the advance, would find themselves worse off on universal credit, would move from a surplus to a shortfall, and around 16,000 children being put at risk of being at risk. So those are the kind of top level figures. So Haroon, I don't know if you've got any sort of comments on those.
Yeah, we were struck really by the findings, particularly around the universal credit, the 5-week wait, and the advance, as you mentioned. Really shocking figures. I think it showed that under the 5-week wait, without the advance, about a quarter of the families in the data set would be unable to even cover their rent. They would be financially in crisis, even as you say, the advance, it helps, but it doesn't completely eliminate that. People are still substantially worse off after a year on universal credit. As I said, the key, really interesting findings, really strong findings. We take the point that they're not nationally representative because it's based on a specific sample of local authorities, but for us, the key point, even though the numbers are shocking, the key point never wasn't really the numbers themselves. It's the key message for us, as I said earlier, is the fact that this analysis can be done, and at a household level. That's the really key thing here. It's really rich analysis, really powerful stuff. And people can have a tendency to think of that as very abstract and nice to have thing, but the really powerful thing here, which I don't think we can stress enough, is that this is household level impact, and that is operationally useful for local services, for local authorities. It's not just about telling us what the aggregate impact is. This is useful for intervening with particular families and households.
So we can, in theory and in practice, identify those households that were being put at risk of being at risk because of the 2-child limit or because of the move to universal credit and having to deal with a 5-week wait, and we can actually pinpoint who those households are for those local authorities we're working with. It's probably worth saying at this point that the analysis we did for the Children's Commissioner was all using data that is anonymized and aggregated for that purpose. But for the as you'll see in a second, the local authorities we're working with, you can actually pinpoint who those households and who those children are, so you can start to take preventative action.
So I'm now going to hand over to Devon to show exactly that, exactly how households can, how local authorities can apply this kind of insight, apply this kind of modeling through our Lift dashboard tool that I mentioned earlier to
Excellent.
action some of these kinds of insight.
Brilliant. So we work with about 36 councils across the UK. We're working with, as Ben said earlier, their administrative data, so housing benefit and council tax support data. And this is a screen that just identifies top level the number of children living in Croydon who are one of our clients, the number of children who are living in low-income families in Croydon, the number of children living in lone parent families, in poverty, in workless families, in food poverty, which is a new measure that we're developing and refining at the moment. That's just a top level overview. I think the really powerful stuff, and be interesting to see, I'll just give you an example here, but if you've got particular cohorts that you'd like to be able to drill down to within your local authority, do please put them into the questions, because this is a screen that's being refined at the moment. So if there are particular use cases that you want to identify and tell us about, we can create a screen both for your local authority and for others that just pinpoints that group. So if we look at families with children, there are 34,508 households in the data set overall. If I just change the number of children, households with between 1 and 9 children, we're down to 14,845 households. If we wanted to focus just on families with young children, and we look at children, say, between the ages of 0 and 5, I just need to put the 5 in here. Then you're able to pinpoint, sorry, just while that's calculated, so this is all being done live on the server. You're able to pinpoint 6,000 households with children between the ages of 0 and 5. Now, this whole project is about identifying those who are at risk of being at risk. Ben identified earlier and talked about the financial resilience measure. So those who have income, what is household income relative to household costs? So if we remove coping and struggling from this grouping, whoops. Ben has a very sensitive mouse. It's very difficult to click on the right things. So coping and struggling are those that have income above their level of expenditure. Those that are at risk or in crisis are facing a cash shortfall from month to month. So we now identified 987 households with children between the ages of 0 and 5 who are facing a cash shortfall month to month. I mean, that's a pretty powerful cohort to then think about who you might want to target. If I sort of look at those that have been impacted by welfare reforms, you're down to, and those that are just heavily impacted, so 320, so you're down to 300 households who are heavily impacted by welfare reforms. So as a result of welfare reforms, these 300 households with children aged 0 to 5 are facing cash shortfall from month to month, arguably through no fault of their own, or arguably because of a change in government policy. So now you can for those authorities, you can download that data set. You can start to work with these households. I won't do that for you now, but you can hover over. This is obviously for demonstration purposes, the data is hashed, but the local authority can click on this. If I click on drill down to household, they can actually see detailed information about that household. So this is a lone parent with 3 children. They're living in the private rented sector. This is their rent. This is their income. This is their modelled expenditure. They are getting council tax support. They're not getting a DHP. They do have some barriers to work related to childcare primarily. And you can see also, if I scroll down, the change in impact under universal credit. It just skipped off at the bottom of the screen there. That's quite useful information. It helps you to think about who to target. If I click on open in calculator though, you can also just load up this case in our benefit and budgeting calculator. And what that can do is simply load up that case directly into our benefit and budgeting calculator and identify actions that family might be able to take to improve their level of financial resilience. So I've just clicked straight in, loaded up that case, click straight into the results screen, and just so we can move back to the presentation quickly, clicked here on information about your case, which runs scenarios and tries to figure out things that the household might be eligible for to help mitigate what they've lost out in as a result of the impacts of welfare reform. So we know there's a warning here, they've got their rent above their local housing allowance. We know that they might be eligible for UC now, but in this case, they're better off under UC. They might qualify for the warm home discount. They might qualify for free school meals. And actually, this gives them actions that they might be able to take for both experienced advisors and inexperienced advisors alike. So that hopefully gives you a sense of how some of these findings can be applied at a local level, as well as the macro level findings that Ben was talking through a moment ago.
Brilliant. Yeah, so if you're following up with the slides, I've included a couple of links on here to some of those tools that we've seen that Devon has just run through, the calculator, information about the LIFT dashboard, and actually something that we've just recently launched, which is a publicly available aggregate version of that dashboard based around our work with Trust for London, showing some of these top level insights across London. You can access that through our website and sort of explore the kinds of analyses that we've done for the CCO in a sort of visual version. So I think now we're gonna jump over to a Q&A. Janet, if you want to say a bit about that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And I hope everybody agrees with me that it's an absolutely fascinating presentation. Lots and lots of information there that you've given us. So I'll just quickly jump on to one of the questions. And please, if I could prompt other people to add, now is the time to add your questions into the panel if you've not already done so. But just one that's come up here, and it was about, I suppose you talked there, Devon, about the data used for demo purposes. So as you said, it was hash data. But to the three of you, I suppose, what would you consider are the main challenges when you're linking children's data with benefits data? So that could be a technical, organisation, cultural. Perhaps you'd have some views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on that one. So this is something we're very much exploring with a number of our local authority clients. We're also working with an academic institution around this problem. We're working with a CCO on it. We're kind of coming at it from a lot of angles. I think there's sort of two pillars of challenge. The first, which is in some senses the easier problem to solve, is the purely technical challenge of getting common identifiers, or actually, you know, identifying a household in one data set and connecting them to their data in the other data set. Children's services data don't tend to use the same sort of unique housing benefit reference numbers or identifiers that we find in welfare data, but that is not so much of a barrier, because we using things like addresses, postcodes, date of birth, we can get to a pretty high level of matching. I would say by far the bigger problem or challenge is around the data security and the kind of data protection GDPR regulations, and making sure that all parties involved are that the data is being processed securely, that the identities are being protected in a suitable way. That is also, I think, a very solvable challenge, but it's one that just requires, and basically the solution to it is communication, more communication between different organizations within local authorities, between DCSs and heads and brevs and bens, and just a clear objective for the linkage. And this is where it comes back to this idea of operationalizing linkage. We're not just wanting to link these data sets together for the sake of it. We're wanting to link data together because it has a dramatic actionable value and benefits for the people who appear in those data sets.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I think that's actually prompted another question from a member of the audience. Perhaps this builds on what you've just said, Ben. What are the data protection grounds for sharing SHEBI data, single housing benefit extract data? There is specific legislation to share BenCap and bedroom tax data, but we've not been able to share anything else.
I'd love to know who that's from. I'm happy to pick up with them afterwards, but if I just say a few words. So the underlying basis for data protection is in the Social Security Act 2012, which talks about using this data for the purposes of local welfare delivery. We've also spent a lot of time with DWP and their memorandums, kind of worked through the Housing Delivery Division's view of how this data can be used. And in essence, there are quite a few powerful use cases that stem from that Social Security Act 2012. Local authorities individually take slightly different interpretations of quite what local welfare delivery means. But I think kind of the underlying point, and happy to go into the specifics of data sharing too, it all stems from that act, and we've got some sort of literature we can share with you on that, including a GDPR primer. But I think the thing to take away is actually a lot of this data can be used to detect fraud, chase arrears. The problems seem to arise when you're trying to use the data to help people, and I find that quite funny. And I think again, I think one of the reasons, and Haroon can say a bit more about this, one of the reasons I think the Children's Commissioner commissioned this work is, as you've said already today, Haroon, to show that this is possible, and the government should be doing more of it. Is that right?
That's right. Whether the data is in local authorities, whether it's here, whether it's sitting in DWP, it already exists. It's already being collected, and there is a legitimate interest and public interest in this type of data processing, which also, I mean, I hear a lot about GDPR, and it does. I think GDPR and the whole issue around data protection, it forces us to be clearer. It forces us to be more rigorous. It doesn't actually prevent anything. I think there's a perception that it prevents things. It forces us to be clear on the lawful basis for processing personal data, and there is a clear lawful basis for doing so here. And it forces us to be clear about a lawful basis for processing any special category basis as well. But all of that can be worked through. The challenge that you were quite right, Ben, to talk about the technical challenges is often the least of our worries. We're making lots of technical progress on that. I think the Troubled Families model shows that it is possible. If you have the political will, if you have that kind of imperative and the resource, then fascinating data linkages can be done at a local level. The culture that's still resistant. I think there's a cultural resistance, but we all have an aversion to data sharing because of scandals that have occurred. But all of those scandals that come to my mind off the top of my head all involved human error, where someone left a laptop on a train, someone emailed a bunch of very vulnerable service recipients with everybody else's email address on the circulation list. This is all admin, human error type stuff. What we're talking about here is automated, large-scale processing for the purpose of anonymized analysis, which is really, and I think we need to do a better job of communicating that those are very, very different things.
Yeah, and I think I was actually on a call with DWP yesterday on this, and I think it's interesting. Two things to take away. I think one, they sort of recognize the Digital Economy Act, but see it as separate legislation, which I thought was quite interesting because they tend to sort of look at things within their own. What have we said we can be used with this data, rather than actually what is the wider legislation say? Excuse me, bless you. And I think the other point is they are listening. Like, their view is that they are listening to local authorities, and they do sort of hear, I think, the same point that was made by the questioner, that they would like to be able to do more with this data. And their challenge and pushback was kind of parliamentary time. I'm never quite sold on that because there's never enough parliamentary time, but here currently they do have quite a good excuse with everyone's minds being on something else. But I think there's lots of room to engage with them. Can I ask, sorry, Janet, to sort of steal prerogative, but I have one follow-up question for Haroon. I mean, you mentioned at the start the Children's Commissioner have this ability to request data. Now, I know that's sort of somewhat heavy-handed, and it's always better to get people to encourage the use of data kind of within the organizations themselves rather than being heavy-handed. But if you could use that power, I'm curious to know what you would use it for. Like, what would be your ideal?
It's interesting. I mean, it seems heavy-handed, but sometimes it's actually beneficial to do that. We've had a few conversations with local and national bodies where they've said, you know what, it would actually be easier for us to hand this data over to you if you sent us a statutory request using your legal powers. It would be easier for us to get this through compliance and get it signed off by the relevant approvals panel. If you just so can you please do that? So sometimes it's heavy-handed, but it's oftentimes helpful. It provides a good reason. But here, I think we are data that local authorities have on children or that bodies have on children. We have requested in the past, particularly in relation to children who are in a particular vulnerable group, children who are maybe in care or in need or using a particular service. We often request that, and that's useful where we just want to report on how many children are there in that group nationally, what are their characteristics. What's really interesting here is, I mean, you know, you're already collecting this this data and doing the modeling, which we can't do. So, you know, that is very much something that you should continue to do. What's really interesting here is the idea about linking. Just going, I'd kind of linked this with the previous question. The idea of linking data on benefits this housing benefit data to perhaps other data. Now this kind of goes a bit outside of our legal powers. Our legal powers can't compel organizations to link together data. We could ask a local authority to give us their housing data, and we could ask the same local authority to give us their children's social care data. We wouldn't be able to link those two data sets together. What I'm really interested in is what local areas can do to do that data linking themselves, because I think there's the really big question here, and it relates to so many other things. It relates to the business case for doing this in the first place. It relates to how we understand vulnerability and prevent things getting worse. We know these children, these families are vulnerable. So Devon pulled up those 300 households in Croydon who are already struggling. They're already unable to make ends meet, and we know they're going to be heavily adversely affected by universal credit. So if universal credit comes in, what do we think is going to be the impact on health outcomes, well-being outcomes, demand for children's social care, demand for housing assistance, demand for debt advice services, demand for family support services? Now, all of those things are services that sit in other bits of the local authority. And for me, the question is, can we bring those into the picture? Can a local authority, if local authorities if local authorities have this data, then they can say, okay, well, here are these households, here are these families, we need to put some support in place now. Otherwise, they're going to show up in these other services, and we should be trying to head that off. The other thing is that if we can link all of this together, then we can start talking about wider impact of universal credit. You know, the government's impact assessments of universal credit talk about very broad measures of financial impact, mainly on the taxpayer, or in the aggregate. There is really no proper evidence on the wider impact of these things. There's lots of, and there's a bit of anecdotal evidence on how it affects people's wider outcomes, some evidence on maybe food bank usage, things like that. But we could start assembling a really strong story about the wider impact of perhaps welfare reforms or other things on other local services. If it is, if we can get that evidence, then that's a crucial part of the kind of the business case, the cost benefit analysis, and how we think about what welfare reform actually leads to.
And for me, Haroon, that's really well put as a broad salvo, because it's the kind of challenge that any one department on their own struggles with. It is about linking that department together across services. But actually, I think, as you sort of said as well, the technical challenges aren't the main ones. It's about kind of creating the mood to move in that direction. And I think that's something Policy and Practice has been doing from the outset. And for me, this is the future of social policy. We're very keen to work with those local authorities that want to get involved in that, and also do so safely, securely, looking after your residents. But fundamentally, as I said earlier, this data can be used to chase debt, detect fraud. How about trying to use it to help people? And those are the kinds of groups we're very keen to work with. Back to you, Janet. Sorry.
Well, I'm actually very conscious of time, so I think that we only have one other question. And if I may, to the person that asked that question, I'll take that offline and get back to you as a follow-up question, if that's okay. Because I know that the next slide, for example, actually builds a little bit about the next steps for us. So, Ben, do you want to just take us quickly through this slide?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's just to echo Devon's point, that's a fantastic point to end on. Let's use this data to help people. That's about as positive and uplifting a note to close on. Just a quick bit of information about what next for our organisations. The Children's Commissioner, as I mentioned, is currently pulling together a much wider piece of research around child homelessness and homelessness risk. Definitely follow them to see more information about that. Policy and practice with regards to this predictive, this sort of early intervention. In-house, we're working on more being able to do more predictive modeling around this data, but we're working with a number of local authorities on linking data sets together, as I said, working with academic institutions and funders as well. So if that's something that if you're a current client of ours and you're interested in this kind of early prevention through data linkage, get in touch with your data contact or the sales team at Policy and Practice, or tweet us. For you, next steps, certainly we would strongly encourage you to start thinking about building early intervention projects using the data that you have at your fingertips if you are a part of a local authority. And if we can help to support that in any way, then reach out to us. And particularly looking at the immense potential that there is behind data linkage, tracking outcomes, predicting service demand, tracking care leaver trajectories, that kind of thing. Making the data start to work to help the households that it captures. And I think we'll probably end it there.
Yeah, so we've just on that slide there, for those of you who are going to get the slides, there's a link to a blog post Ben wrote, which actually expands on a lot of the stuff we've talked about today. So that's just in the slides. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much to our speakers as well. It's been a cracking webinar. We've had a lot to talk through. As I mentioned at the outset, there are a few downloads for you to take from your panel on the right-hand side. And immediately after this webinar, there'll be a very short survey. So you can ask further questions of the speakers and basically just generally tell us what you think. Tell us, put your hand up for us to get in touch with you and to take you through the information in more detail. We did go through it at pace today. And also if you're interested in our next webinar in May about how frontline organisations can prepare for managed migration, you can put your hand up for that as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our speakers, Devon Galani, Haroon Chowdry, and Ben Fell from Policy and Practice. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all. Thank you.